All right. Thank you so much. Welcome to another episode of the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. My name is Fred Diamond. I'm the author of Love, Hope, Lyme, with family members, partners, and friends who love a chronic Lyme survivor need to know. And of course, I'm the host of this podcast, the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. You could find the book on Amazon, of course. Nicole, I've made the ebook free for Lyme survivors from day one. So if you're listening to this or watching and you'd like the free ebook, just reach out to me on Facebook or LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to send it to you. I've sent out, Nicole, probably 1,000 e-versions of the book. And if you want a signed copy, feel free to reach out to me as well via Facebook or via LinkedIn, whichever, and I'd be happy to send you a couple of signed copies for you to give to your family members. So when I wrote the book, Love, Hope, Lyme, I met so many amazing leaders in the Lyme community, doctors, medical practitioners, charity directors, advocates, and they've all helped me to understand what living with Lyme is all about. So on the podcast, which we produce and post every 2 weeks, I've invited them to share their insights into how you can support those you love. And if you're a chronic Lyme survivor, the podcast will help you understand how you can let your family and friends support you, how you need to be supported. Nicole, that was actually a very interesting thing I learned. When I wrote the book and started the podcast, I thought it was going to be for Lyme friends and family members. But what I found is I've had more listeners and people who've responded who are Lyme survivors who are looking for ways to tell their families, friends, and partners how they need to be supported. So we got a special show today. I'm very excited. My guest is Nicole Malachowski, and her story is quite remarkable. She's the first woman Thunderbird pilot, combat veteran, fighter squadron commander, White House fellow, and advisor. You're also an inductee into both the National Women's Hall of Fame and the Women in Aviation International Pioneer Hall of Fame. Air Force, first off, thank you for your service, and tick-borne illness survivor.
Yes, sir.
Which is how you've, the story that you've been telling via TED Talks, and you're out there speaking and you're going to places telling the story. And people who listen to this podcast, they know it's typically 15 minutes, 20 minutes at the most, 3 questions, boom, boom, boom. And I do it like that specifically because when I wanted to learn more about what someone in my life was dealing with as it relates to Lyme disease and tick-borne illness, I realized that I didn't do a whole lot of research until I said, I need to know more about this. But I want to delve a little bit deeper into your story because it's quite fascinating and just everything related to it. And we don't need to go too much into the details of how you got known for this because that story is available. But I want to hear more about what you've been doing, how you do it, so that our listeners can learn from you and they could help communicate to their family members, partners, and friends what they need to survive from this disease. All right, Nicole, introduce yourself. Tell us a little more about how you got to this point. And I'm very, very excited to talk to you about this story.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, Fred, and I want to thank you first for what you're doing for our community, which is not just the patients and the caregivers, but all of the friends and family and loved ones, who care about us. So thank you for doing that. Like most people in this community, I was involuntarily recruited by a tick bite. This was not a position or a place that I ever thought I would find myself being in. Big picture, my tick-borne illness odyssey, as I call it, began back in the summer of 2012. I was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. At the time, I was a fighter pilot flying the F-15E Strike Eagle, and I was the commander of an F-15E fighter squadron. All this to say that I was physically fit, mentally fit, spiritually fit. Things in my life were going great. And one day in the summer of 2012, I came down with what felt like the summer flu, the fatigue, the malaise, the low-grade fever, and I ended up getting a rash on my right hip. I now know exactly what that rash was. I was one of the lucky ones who actually had a very typical bullseye rash. As I didn't improve over 2 to 4 weeks, started feeling worse, getting headaches, I went to the doctor. And this was military medicine on base at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. And I remember saying, I'm not feeling well. Oh, by the way, I also have this little rash. And that rash by that time had grown to about 6 inches across. And I remember distinctly him looking at that and going, that's interesting. So much so that he called in another doctor. Both of them listened to my symptoms, stared at that rash, and I will never forget this fateful day. They said, well, we don't have Lyme disease in North Carolina, so it must be a spider bite. And that was the day that my life changed forever. And that was the day that I became chronically ill. Fast forward, obviously, my symptoms would start to increase in severity, increase in frequency, and they would start to spread across all of my body. Within 3 to 6 months, I was having neurological problems, things like word finding, things like short-term and long-term memory loss. I was dropping things with my right hand, dragging my right leg. At that point, the doctor started looking at me for multiple sclerosis. Ironically, I moved to Rhode Island during that time for an assignment at the Naval War College, where about 9 months after my rash, I pulled a fully engorged tick off of my back right thigh. That's when I started getting the night sweats, or what I now know as my babesia microti symptoms. Fast forward over the next 4 years, I was a medical mystery, struggling every day to get out of bed, struggling every day to hold on to my career. At that point, they had grounded me. I've been flying since I was 12 years old. It's all I knew. And now I'm the fighter pilot who can't fly. And I found myself working at the White House. And in the summer of 2016, things got so bad that when I woke up in bed, so this is about 4 years later, I was basically having moments of temporary paralysis, moments of temporary locked-in syndrome. I cannot tell you how terrifying and absolutely mortifying that was. Imagine being like a television and someone's got a remote control on you. They could turn you up, turn you down, turn you off, turn you on. That was me. I would go from unable to walk, talk, read, and write to somehow able to speak again. And it was just in and out, very concerning. At that point, the Air Force, to their credit, did cut bait and send me up to Boston, Massachusetts, where I was seen at the Dean Center for Tick-Borne Illness and worked in conjunction with a multidisciplinary team at Massachusetts General Hospital. My husband and I had been advocating for the Air Force to check for all tick-borne illnesses for 4 years. We were denied, basically told Lyme disease doesn't exist. What are these other tick-borne illnesses and co-infections? We've never heard of those. These are so rare. We've sent you everywhere. You've gone to the Mayo Clinic. You've gone to Walter Reed Bethesda. We've ruled this out. You know, it's got to be either neuropsychiatric, right? Or it's got to be fibromyalgia. So that's where we stood. But at this point, when they noticed that I was having this kind of temporary, like in and out locked in syndrome, which is what it was, they sent me up to Boston. They did cast the net wide, and lo and behold, I did have an infection on my brain. It was located on the pons area of my brainstem. And for those of you who are maybe familiar with the brain, you know that the pons is actually pretty darn important. And that is where locked-in syndrome happens. So there was a very quick sense of urgency to get me treated as fast as possible. To be clear, I tested positive for 5 different tick-borne illnesses. I'd like to let the listeners know: Borrelia burgdorferi, Borrelia hermsii, Anaplasma, Babesia microti, and Bartonella Hensley. And so basically for 4 years, it had been multiplying, getting worse, getting further into the central nervous system until I found myself obviously completely broken. So from the time of that first rash to the time of my accurate diagnosis and beginning treatment was 1,525 days, more than 24 doctors across 8 specialties, and 3 misdiagnoses along the way. I will forever be grateful to Dr. Nevena Zubčević for saving my life, as well as the team at Massachusetts General Hospital. So that started about 9 months of being bedridden, not able to really walk, talk, read, or write in any meaningful way, and another 1.5 years in rehab. During that 2-year period, again, mostly bedridden and housebound, unable to interact with my children, who were between the ages of 5 and 7 at that time. And I lost my career. So the Air Force medically retired me. And it's interesting. I always keep this paperwork here, Fred, because it still blows my mind. I like to show people. It's my Air Force Form 356, dated 21 July 2017. It's the findings and recommendations of my medical evaluation board. And here's what it says: 100% unfit for duty due to chronic systemic tick-borne illness. Right there. And so I was medically retired for chronic systemic tick-borne illness, and I found myself thrust out of the military, out of everything I'd known since I was 17 years old. It was extremely disorienting. I felt abandoned. I felt betrayed. I remember thinking, who am I if I'm not wearing my nation's uniform? You know, what's my contribution to society if I'm not flying fighter jets? You know, how am I going to provide for my family? When is this going to get better? And since 2017, I found myself deep in this community, meeting wonderful people like you, as well as all of the people who are tuning in here. So that's the nutshell story.
Uh,
Sorry, that's
Wow.
long.
Yeah, nothing to be sorry about. It's amazing because I've had it's funny. I started my moment happened in April of 2021 when I realized I wanted to learn more about what someone close to me was dealing with as it relates to Lyme disease. And I published an article in lymedisease.org in late August of 2021, posted on Facebook, started joining groups. So I've had so many people who, and I've communicated on Facebook, I've communicated on LinkedIn. I'm like probably one of the only people who speaks about tick-borne illness on LinkedIn as I relate it to the sales process, if you will. But so people reach out to me all the time with a news article they'll find or a celebrity. And I must have gotten a half a dozen people who reached out and said, Fred, you need to reach out to Nicole to get her to tell her story. So I'm glad that your story is getting out there. But like you also said too, you didn't volunteer for this. I guess you were bitten somewhere in North Carolina, you presume?
Yeah, I'll never be able to say exactly where, but here's what I can tell you. What I can tell you is about 2 weeks prior to me seeing that rash, we did our annual, what we call survival training, climbing around on our hands and knees out in the woods of Eastern North Carolina. Nowhere in my military career did we ever discuss tick bite prevention. I didn't know anything about permethrin or picaridin. I didn't know how to remove a tick properly. I had no idea how to do a tick check. I had no idea what symptoms to look for. And clearly military medicine had no idea how to diagnose and treat this. And so I think it is highly probable that my tick bite occurred during my survival training in Eastern North Carolina.
So I'm going to ask you some questions, Nicole, that I typically don't ask on the Love Hope Lyme podcast, and you could choose to answer them or not. Something that you kind of brought up here as well is that when the Lyme symptoms, really take hold, a lot of women and men for that matter. So if I say women, it could be both. It doesn't really matter. As a matter of fact, in my book, I talk about how women go through this disease, but it could easily be a man. Doesn't really matter. But you talked about, you're in the military, you were flying, jets, and you just don't wake up and say, you know what, I'm going to be flying jets for the military tomorrow. I'm done flipping burgers. You went through the rigorous training. Obviously the US government just the Air Force just doesn't allow anyone to fly jets. You're at the highest level of your profession, right? And the service that you were doing, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about, because part of the purpose of the Love Hope Lyme podcast is to get family members, friends, and partners to understand what their loved ones are going through. Talk a little bit about what you were feeling as you couldn't do that anymore because of this disease, if you don't mind sharing some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a fantastic question because the only word that comes to mind for me is devastated, right? Absolutely devastated to lose the career that I had invested so much time and effort and energy in. I was 5 years old when I made the decision to become a fighter pilot, and I was maniacally focused as a child. I was 12 years old when I started flying. I was 16 years old when I soloed my first plane. I had been a fighter pilot for, well over 12 years when all of this started happening. The amount of, time and treasure and investment that goes into that, it was my passion. It was what I did, it was who I felt like I was. It was in a lot of ways, I felt like it was my identity. Now, I've matured through this. I've gotten older. I think I have clarity going through such a crucible experience like tick-borne illness. And so I now know that your job shouldn't be your identity. But man, at that time, right? To be one of only, 2,000 fighter pilots in the entire United States Air Force, right? One of only 75 women at that time who had done it. A person who flew as one of only 6 Thunderbird pilots, and boom, right? I go from this really elite, high-performing person, right? Physically and mentally and just in my career to just completely broken overnight. I couldn't do anything for myself. I was 100% dependent on other people for all of my activities of daily living. And everything. And I'm sitting there thinking, how is this? I am this independent, confident type A fighter pilot. And now I can't even go to the restroom by myself or bathe by myself. I mean, overnight, right? That fall is something I will never forget. And being at that rock bottom is something I will never, forget. It's a complete loss of your sense of self. And I'm getting very passionate here, but hopefully that answers your question.
No, I'm glad. I'm actually, to be honest with you, I'm getting very choked up listening to this story because I've heard this so many times. You're the first military pilot that I've spoken to in the context of tick-borne illness, but I've spoken to women who have PhDs, women who taught at universities, and men for that matter too, but who had senior positions with well-known brand companies who couldn't anymore, who went through some of the things. How were you treated by, I want to know, how were you treated by the men in the military as this was happening to you? And I'm also curious, if you don't mind, how you were treated by other women as well. And you could answer both questions if you choose.
Sure. I think that the treatment from the men and the women that I worked with and, around and for, or who worked with me, was the same. I didn't necessarily notice a difference in gender. I think, there's really deep ties in the military, right? Culture is a big thing. That wingman contract that we have each other is a very big thing, like leave nobody behind and all of that, played out initially. I think initially people were like, wow, I can't believe Nicole Malachowski, for all intents and purposes, a poster child of the United States Air Force is struggling, so much. But what happens with this illness is as time goes by, right, days of sympathy turn into weeks of sympathy, people start to get tired of sympathy at the months, and months turn into years. It's very hard for people to stay committed to that sympathy and to that empathy because they're not in your shoes. And even if they want to be, you don't get it until you get it. And that's the beauty, I think, of what you're doing with your book and your podcast, is we're really trying to help people understand how bad, how horrible, tick-borne illnesses really could be. So I would say for those first, 3 months, 6 months, there was a lot of things, right? A lot of people supporting and checking in and all of that. And then boom, it went away. My last year in the Air Force, so I was housebound. They put me in what's called a patient squadron billet. Basically, they take your manning position and they move you, and your job is to be a patient and heal. Cool, right? You would think that's awesome, except it's not. For that entire year, not one person from the Air Force, anyone, called to check in on me or my husband. When I mentioned the words abandonment and betrayal earlier, I fully believe it then, and I still feel it very much, very painfully, very deeply today. And I'm talking about my chain of command, my supervisors. I'm also talking about the very people I flew in combat with. That sadness of my loss of friendships, the loss of that wingman network, the fact that the very organization who I pledged like literally my life to, right? I flew in combat. Couldn't take care of me or even check in on me or even bother. I will never get over that. I am not over that. I am not.
What do you, for people who are listening, again, the show is created for family members, partners, and friends. But like I said before, a large part of the audience are people who are looking to communicate to partners, families, and friends. What do you think that was? Do you think it was just kind of like they didn't understand tick-borne illness, Lyme disease? I mean, it's amazing. When I wrote my book, I have this one line where I said, if you're anywhere in the United States, there's a good chance the doctor or the ER won't understand unless you're in Connecticut. And I've had 50 people who edited my book. And so people in Connecticut said, and even in Connecticut, matter of fact, I actually met someone recently for dinner who's a Lyme survivor in Hudson Valley, which is one of the ground zeros where Dr. Horowitz and Cameron are all based. And they even explain Lyme disease to people who didn't understand it. One thing I do want to say also as well is that when your doctor said, we don't have Lyme in North Carolina, there's a great documentary that came out, which I'm sure you probably saw, The Quiet Epidemic, where they, in the very opening scenes, they show birds all over the country with ticks attached to them. And
well, I have state passports, right? They don't cross from what I understand.
So is it because of the people not talk because of ignorance, because of they weren't, I mean, it is a mysterious disease. What do you think that was from?
All of the above, Fred, all of the above. I think part of it starts with there's compassion fatigue. I think that's a very human thing. I think that applies across all different kinds of illnesses, right? When you are chronically sick or going through something, a severe illness or disease, right? Whether it's tick-borne illness or cancer or anything in between, you become a very like almost unreliable person, right? You can't make plans. You're not sure if you're going to be able to follow through on things. And that gets tiring for people, right? They don't know how to predict, because you used to be a predictable friend. Now you're no longer a predictable friend. I've never had this, so I can sit and listen as much as I want, but I've got compassion fatigue. I can't plan my life anymore because I can't depend on you to follow through. I think one of the hardest things for me was that I learned a long time ago, in order to have friends, you have to be a friend. And one of the things that's hard for me even to this day is a lot of my symptoms, especially when I was at my worst, you can't be a good friend, right? It almost becomes more one-sided, you know what I mean? And you want to be a good friend, but this disease stops you from being as reliable and dependable and follow through as you can be. So there's compassion fatigue. Absolutely. The lack of education and awareness about all tick-borne illnesses and how horrible they can be and how you can indeed remain chronically ill even after treatment. That lack of education and awareness is one of the biggest obstacles we have to overcome. So I think that is part of it. And I think people just aren't. Chronic illness requires patience, and patience on the part of the patient, patience on the part of the caregivers and loved ones and friends, and not everyone has the same level of patience. And I think too, let's be honest, let's just call it what it is. The unnecessary controversy, the unnecessary stigma, the outright mocking of patients makes it hard for other people to be courageous on your behalf. It's hard enough to be for us as patients to be courageous in the face of that mocking and that stigma. Let me give you an example. At my very worst, so I would say this was maybe 2 months before I woke up locked in. Okay, so I am at the worst. The Air Force had sent me to Walter Reed in Bethesda, Maryland, right? A fantastic hospital. And I saw a rheumatologist. Now I'm a full bird colonel at this time. This guy is a Navy captain. So these are both 06s. We're both like in our 40s, mature professionals. He came in, he spent, I remember I timed it because I was like, I know how this is going to go, right? He spent about 5 minutes and 20 seconds with me. He decided that it was neuropsychiatric. Okay. So I'll never forget. He looked right at me. He put his hand on top of my hand, very condescendingly, very patronizing. And he looked me in the eye and he said, quote, "You have been a high-performing woman in a male-dominated career field for many years. Maybe this is your body's way of saying it's time to retire," end quote. And so the stigma and this psychologizing of a very deep medical, biological issue scares people, right? They see how the CDC, the NIH, a lot of these doctors, we all know who they are, treat us, and they don't want any part of it. There's a lot.
What's incredible as we're talking here, and I've spoken to thousands of people over the last 2 years, that I'm talking to you with your level of achievement, right? And this happened to you. And again, I'm not trying to be whatever. I'm trying to be just totally honest with you here. It's just it's insane that this disease, it's indiscriminatory. Anybody can, like you just said, no one signed up for it. Anybody can get bitten by a tick. You could be a billionaire's daughter, and there's been some billionaires' daughters who've written books about this, and you could be just an average person who happened to be walking on a trail with your family, and next thing you know, 2 weeks later, you have all the pains that you were talking about. Nicole, one of the purposes of the podcast is to help educate family members, partners, and friends about what their loved one is going through. What would be 2 or 3 things that you would like them to know, again, family members, partners, or friends, about what somebody with Lyme and other tick-borne illnesses might be going through?
Well, I think that the hardest thing is, when you find out you have Lyme disease or a tick-borne illness, I think instantaneously we fall back on the conditioning that society has given us, right? That you have a diagnosis, right? You're going to have compassion and support from the medical system. You're going to get treated and you're going to get better. That is not how this works out. It should be that way, and our community is working towards changing it to that. But I think you have to understand that this is like entering the Twilight Zone. I mean, this is a labyrinth to try to navigate just to get access to care and just to get support. And so all of a sudden you're dealing with all of these horrific physical and even mental health symptoms that Lyme and tick-borne illness can cause. And you're having to navigate a system that doesn't believe you, doesn't support you, and honestly has not much right now to offer you in terms of care. It is a level of exhaustion that I cannot explain with words, I think, appropriately. So I think we need you to people to understand and believe us, right? When we say, no, it's really not that easy to get access to care. No, you actually, not everyone is cured on 21 days of doxycycline, or no, I really can't get an appointment here or there. I need you to believe. And that kind of leads into this other idea of like, supporting. How do you support a patient, like us, that's trying to navigate this labyrinth that's not supportive, all while dealing with just horrific, right, physical symptoms? How do you support them? I think getting involved with the research, read the research. I mean, the science is out there. This is the part that blows my mind. Everything that our community is saying and screaming into this void is supported in the peer-reviewed literature. Why more doctors in mainstream medicine and our government kind of agencies are cherry picking, the science is beyond me, but believe the person, support them, read the science and the literature with them, get on the same, with the same nonprofits, on social media, read it, listen to how other patients are feeling. You'll start to see and understand, I think, what we're actually, going through. The other thing is, one of the things I wish I would have done sooner is bring people to all my appointments. I'll tell you, I didn't know what the word gaslighting meant prior to becoming a tick-borne illness patient, but I know what it is now. I found that I was treated more seriously and more respectfully and with dignity every time I brought somebody with me. So that power differential when the door closes and it's just the doctor and the patient, that's a skewed power differential, right? When you bring somebody else in with you, it starts to right it just a little bit. I'm rambling a little bit there, but believe them, do the research, support them, show up if you can, and by all means be flexible. Because I don't know on any given day, to this day, because I look healthy, but I am not. I don't know on any given day what I am or am not going to be able to do, what I am or am not going to be able to follow through on. So flexibility is the key to being a good partner and a good friend to somebody like me.
No, those are great answers. And actually, a lot of people tell me that they look fine, right? It's like, it's interesting. Actually, I met with someone recently at a Lyme book signing that I did. And this was a gentleman who was 70 and he had Lyme for probably 15, 20 years. And he looked good. And I said, I even made the mistake. I said, you look great. And what I meant was you look great for 70. And then I remember his wife and he kind of looked at each other side eyes. And I said, I didn't mean that to come across as, because I know if you have the chronic illness, it's always there and you might be looking great and presentable, et cetera. What shouldn't they be doing? What is some of your advice for family members, partners, friends that maybe they're doing some things that you would like to advise them not to do?
I think it comes down to kind of the doubting things like, are you sure? When people who are close to you start to suggest that it's all in your head, that is extremely demoralizing. I think don't detract from things that the patient is trying. Look, the fact is that for those of us who kind of have long Lyme or long tick-borne illness, chronic Lyme, whatever we want to call it, believe you me, we are trying everything, whether it's different supplements or different diets. Don't detract for that, right? Unless you have something better to offer, which I would be very hesitant to offer anything because we have done the research. We don't want to be sick. We don't want to feel this way. We don't want to live our lives in this level of pain and dysfunction. And so don't detract. That means if it's getting the gluten-free pizza crust, do it. If they want to take, coenzyme Q10, you're going to support that, right? Because remember, mainstream medicine has nothing to offer us right now. All right. So when we're trying these different things, try to be, I think, as supportive as you can. And I mentioned earlier, don't lose patience. This is a long game. Yeah. The word chronic, by its very definition, means that it's a long game. And so Waking up every morning is hard for us to do every day, even this morning, knowing I was going to have the privilege of meeting you and talking about something I'm passionate about. Like, it takes forever to get out of bed, just to physically swing my legs over the side of the bed. Like, patience is so vital. And when I was a fighter pilot, when we would go into combat, which in a lot of ways is what all of us are in, we are all in combat against this disease and the medical system that doesn't support us. I used to say to my wingmen, before we would launch, like, literally, we're all dressed, we're going out to the jets. I would say, no matter what, as a wingman, be a help, not a hindrance. Be a help, not a hindrance. Ask yourself, is what I'm about to say or do going to be helpful, or is it going to be a hindrance? And then, move out.
Before I ask you for your final thought, again, I'm just going to ask this question, and if you don't want to answer it, it's fine. You have such passion, obviously, and you've taken this on. What's it like to be a fighter pilot? You talked about from age of 5, you wanted to be a pilot, and age 12, I think you said, you wanted to be a jet pilot. I kind of hate asking that question because I know you're not anymore and it's past, but what is it like to be not one of the 75 women who've flown planes, but when you're in the air, when you're in a mission, give us a sense, if you don't mind, what is it like?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, I miss it, first of all, and I'd still be doing it if it wasn't for that tick and the lack of education and awareness. But being a fighter pilot is absolutely, like, exhilarating, right? Let's put combat aside for a second. Let's just talk about peacetime and training. To be out there in the sky, it's powerful, it's graceful, it's free, right? It's all about just pure freedom, power, and grace all combined. It's a heck of a lot of fun. The technology is just a kick in the pants. The fact that this little gal who grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, got to fly 2 of the world's greatest fighter jets, like, still to this day, blows my mind. When we talk about going into combat, right, and doing the high risk type work, I want people to understand, while it is a physical job, right, pulling 9 Gs in a high performance fighter is hard on your body, but it's a mental job, right? So the amount of just intense focus is mind-blowing. I mean, when you're flying greater than the speed of sound, you are constantly having to think well in front of the jet. Where do I want the jet to be in time and space 1 second from now, 5 seconds from now, 10 miles from now? It's a mental game, 100%, that takes a lot of training, a lot of discipline, a lot of, commitment. And when you ask me this question, what's it like to be a fighter pilot flying? I always tell people, when I would land, I was just mentally exhausted. It was like you had run a mental marathon after a combat mission and you just needed to nap. But here's the important thing about me being a fighter pilot for over 21 years before a tick stole that from me. Yeah. Everything that I needed to be a good fighter pilot, right? Discipline, focus, commitment, determination, confidence, all of those things are the traits and the characteristics I needed in order to survive the worst depths of my illness and to thrive today, even though I still live with chronic symptoms. All of those characteristics and traits I just stated apply to every single patient who's watching right now, and you all should be proud of yourselves. I find that it has been harder to be a tick-borne illness patient than it ever was to fly in combat. I have found the people and the friends and the community of Lyme disease and tick-borne illness, these human beings, to be as courageous and even more so in some cases as honorable and noble as the fighter pilots and the men and women that I went to war with. So while this is not where I expected to find myself, we're all fighter pilots and I'm your wingman. We're all wingmen kind of rowing in the same direction. And if I hadn't have been a fighter pilot, I don't know that I would be standing here today talking to you.
Yeah. And I want to thank you for that answer. I want to applaud you. I know people have recognized you, but for what you're doing now, and again, like I mentioned in the beginning, thank you for your service to our country. Quite noble. But what you're doing now, I mean, the ability to speak the way you're speaking, the bravery that you had to come out the way you did about how you were treated, and actually what you just shared with our audience for the last 30 minutes, but being out there with your energy, your lucid thinking, on what the situation has been like is actually quite remarkable. And I know from again, I don't have Lyme. Something you said before is you don't get it until you get it. And what I usually say at the end of that is, and you never want to get it.
Correct.
But but your clarity in communicating and the fact that you're out there speaking to audiences and companies, what's the easiest way for people to reach you? Before I ask you for your final thought, should people just find you? How should they find you if they want to find you?
Yeah, I mean, I have a website. It's NicoleMalachowski.com. I am on LinkedIn, Twitter, as well as Instagram. My handle on both Twitter and Instagram is at Real Malachowski, REAL Malachowski. I don't know why I have faker profiles, but I do. So make sure you're at Real Malachowski. I love what I do, as a patient advocate alongside so many other wonderful advocates and organizations. I did want to highlight one right now, if you let me. I'm the chair of patient advocacy at Invisible International, founded by Dr. Nevena Zubcevic, who is the person who saved my life. It is basically to shine a light, right, on the challenges surrounding all invisible illnesses, with certainly a special, focus, if you will, on tick-borne illnesses. And one of the amazing things that they do is they have created, this is mind-blowing, fully accredited free CME for doctors and medical providers. And so when we as patients, caregivers, and friends interact with doctors and the medical community who say chronic Lyme doesn't exist, the tests are great, everyone's cured on 14 to 21 days of doxycycline, please send them to Invisible International, free accredited CME, and they can actually learn the real science behind what all of us are enduring. And last thought, Fred, we talked a lot about the hardships, right? We talked a lot about the suffering, and that's all very real. There is a lot of great things going on. I have seen the momentum in the last 3 to 5 years just accelerating at a pace that I could have never imagined. Look at the scientists, the doctors, the clinicians, the nonprofit leaders, the advocates who are out there making a difference. I feel excited. Like, we are so close, I think, in my lifetime to this tipping point. This tipping point for Lyme disease, and tick-borne illnesses. And while I hate the suffering that our friends in the long COVID community are enduring, the fact that we are joining forces, the fact that ME, CFS, fibromyalgia are all coming together right now, this is momentum. This is a tipping point. This is something we should all be excited about. And this is something that gives me hope.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Wow. Once again, I want to thank Nicole Malachowski for being on today's Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. My name is Fred Diamond. You're welcome. My name is Fred Diamond.